Sir, I need you to step back.
Who do you think you are? You don't tell me what to do!
Richard Kane had never learned how to apologize. Not because he lacked the vocabulary, but because in 45 years of living, no one had ever made him feel like he needed to. He had been born into wealth, refined that wealth into a personal empire, and constructed around himself a world so carefully insulated by money, lawyers, and loyalty that consequences the kind that visited ordinary people had simply never found the door. He didn't yell at people out of cruelty, at least not in his own mind. He yelled because he was efficient, because his time was worth more than most people earned in a month, and because in Richard's experience, the loudest voice in the room was always the one that got what it wanted. What Richard Kane didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined on the morning he walked into Meridian General Hospital, was that the woman he was about to humiliate had a brother. And that brother had a very long memory, a private jet, and absolutely no patience for men like Richard Kane. Monica Williams arrived at Meridian General at 6:15 every morning, 45 minutes before her shift began. She arrived early, not because the hospital required it, but because she had learned years ago that preparation was the only currency she could always count on. Her locker held an extra set of scrubs, a photograph of her mother taped to the inside of the door, and a handwritten note she had written to herself during her second year of nursing school, when the work had felt impossible and the nights had felt endless. The note said simply, "Someone needs you today. Be there." She had read it every morning since, and she had never once let it become a cliché. Monica was 32 years old, a registered nurse in the emergency department, and she was, by any reasonable measure, exceptional at her job. Her colleagues called her steady. Her patients called her kind. Her supervisor, Dr. Patricia Howe, had written in Monica's last performance review that she possessed a quality of presence that cannot be trained away of making frightened people feel safe. Monica kept that review folded inside the same locker, tucked behind the photograph of her mother, who was 61 now and living in a small apartment in Queens that Monica paid for on her nurse's salary, supplemented by the weekend shifts she picked up whenever the floor was short-staffed, which was often. Monica had grown up in the foster care system, moved between 9 different placements before the age of 12, and had learned to carry herself in a way that revealed nothing she didn't choose to reveal. She did not speak often about her childhood, not because it shamed her, but because she had decided long ago that the past was a place to understand, not a place to live. What she did speak about, to the few colleagues who knew her well enough to ask, was a boy she had met when she was 8 years old and he was 7, during a brief overlap at a group home in the Bronx. His name was Daniel. He was small for his age, Korean-born, recently arrived in the American foster system through a series of bureaucratic circumstances that no 7-year-old should have had to navigate alone. He spoke almost no English. Monica spoke it fluently, though she had no one to thank for that, except the public library, and the determination that had always lived somewhere in her chest like a second heartbeat. She had taught him words. He had followed her everywhere. Within 2 weeks, they had become inseparable, and within 2 months, a social worker with kind eyes and a file thicker than a paperback novel had written, in her report, that the 2 children had formed what she described as a sibling bond of unusual strength. They called each other brother and sister. They meant it completely. When Daniel was eventually placed with a Korean-American family in New Jersey, a wealthy couple who would later relocate to Seoul, Monica had stood at the door of the group home and watched his car pull away. And she had not cried, because she was 8 years old, and she had already learned that crying didn't change what happened next. But she had pressed her hand flat against the window of the door until the car turned the corner and disappeared, and she hadn't moved for a long time after that. Richard Kane existed in a different world entirely. His father, Gerald Kane, had built a modest real estate business in Connecticut over 4 decades of grinding, careful work. Richard had taken that business, leveraged it aggressively, and transformed it into Kane Properties Group, a firm valued at somewhere north of $4 billion, depending on the quarter and the mood of the market. He owned buildings in 7 cities, had his name on 2 stadiums, and was 3 weeks away from closing what his CFO described as the defining transaction of the company's history, a $900 million acquisition of a mixed-use development portfolio along the fixed-use development, Hudson River waterfront. Richard had not slept more than 5 hours a night in the past 3 weeks. He was running on espresso ambition, and the particular kind of adrenaline that only comes from being close to something enormous. He was also, on the morning of October 14th, worried about his father. Gerald Kane had been admitted to Meridian General 2 days earlier following a cardiovascular episode. The doctors were careful with their language, but Richard heard heart attack and translated it accordingly. He had not sat with his father as long as he should have. He had taken calls in the hallway, reviewed contracts on his phone in the waiting room, and found that he was not being the son he should be. That guilt had nowhere to go, so it became irritability. And the irritability had nowhere to go either, so it became the particular loaded silence of a man looking for something to push against. He found it on the morning of October 14th, when he turned a corner on the 3rd floor of Meridian General and nearly collided with Monica Williams, who was moving quickly down the hallway with a medication tray, her eyes already tracking the room numbers ahead of her, her mind already 3 steps ahead of her body, the way it always was when the floor was busy. Richard's shoulder caught the edge of the tray. Nothing spilled. Monica steadied it with the practiced reflex of someone who had done this thousands of times, and she said, automatically, "Excuse me," and kept walking, because she had 4 patients who needed her, and the shift had been running behind since 6:15. Richard stopped. He turned. He looked at the back of her as she moved away, and something about the fact that she had not turned to look at him, had not recognized him, had not apologized more elaborately, had simply said, "Excuse me," and kept moving, lodged itself in him like a splinter. He followed her to the nurse's station. He stood at the counter and said, loudly enough for the 2 other nurses nearby to look up, that he needed to speak with whoever was responsible for his father's care. Monica set down the tray, turned to face him, and recognized him not personally, but by type, with the particular clarity of someone who had worked in emergency medicine long enough to know the difference between a worried family member and a man looking to transfer his anxiety into authority. She gave him her full attention and told him calmly that his father's care team would be available for an update at 10 o'clock, which was the scheduled family consultation time. Richard said that 10 o'clock didn't work for him. Monica said she understood and that she could pass a message to Dr. Howe, who was currently with another patient. Richard said he didn't want a message, he wanted answers, and that he had been waiting for 2 days while nobody seemed to be in any particular hurry. Monica kept her voice even. She told him that his father was being monitored closely, that the care team was actively managing his condition, and that she was not in a position to provide a full clinical briefing in the hallway, but that she would ensure Dr. Howe was notified of his request. Richard looked at her for a moment. The way men like him sometimes looked at people who didn't immediately rearrange themselves around his convenience with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was its close relative. And then he said, in a voice that was quiet enough to pass as controlled and loud enough to carry, that he didn't think she quite understood who she was talking to. Monica said, without missing a beat, that she understood he was Mr. Kane, that she respected how difficult the situation was for his family, and that she was doing everything she could within her responsibilities. Richard said something then that several witnesses would later describe identically. He said that perhaps her responsibilities were the problem, and that someone with her level of competence probably shouldn't be trusted with a case of this significance. He said it slowly. He said it clearly. He let each word land the way a man who has always had money learns to let words land with the patient weight of someone who knows they will not be contradicted. The 2 nurses at the station looked at their monitors. A resident who had been writing notes at the far end of the counter became very still. Monica looked at Richard Kane without flinching. She said, quietly and without any theater at all, that she would make sure Dr. Howe received his message immediately. Then she picked up the medication tray and walked away. Richard watched her go. He was not finished. The situation escalated at 11:47 in the morning. Gerald Kane's blood pressure had spiked, and the monitors at his bedside had triggered an alert that pulled 2 nurses and a resident to his room simultaneously. Monica was among them. What Richard saw when he arrived, having been paged by a different staff member who had the unfortunate task of finding him in the family lounge, was controlled medical activity. What Richard interpreted, in the state he was in, was chaos, and Monica at the center of it, and his father lying in that bed looking smaller than he had ever looked, and all of the fear and guilt that Richard had been refusing to feel for 3 days suddenly having no place left to hide. He stood in the doorway. He watched Monica move to the IV line, adjust something, call out numbers to the resident. He decided, in the way that frightened men sometimes decide things, that what was happening was her fault, that she had been slow, that she had been distracted, that if she had been doing her job properly in the first place, none of this would be happening now. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He said her name though he didn't know it. So he said, "Hey," and when she didn't immediately respond because she was in the middle of a clinical adjustment that required her attention, he reached out and put his hand on her shoulder and turned her, and when she turned, already saying, "Sir, I need you to step back," he struck her across the face. The sound was very small. That was what people remembered afterward, how small the sound was and how large the silence that followed it. Monica's ID badge, clipped to her lapel, fell to the floor. The room stopped. The resident stopped. The other nurse stopped. Even the monitors seemed to hold their breath for a half-second before resuming their soft, indifferent rhythm. Richard stood with his hand still extended, and for a moment his face held the expression of a man who had not fully caught up to what his body had just done. Monica did not stumble. She did not cry. She reached down, picked up her ID badge from the floor, with a deliberateness that was more devastating than any outburst could have been, and she clipped it back to her lapel. She looked at Richard Kane with eyes that were steady and clear and entirely unafraid. She said, in a voice so calm, it filled the room more completely than a shout, "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Then she turned back to her patient. A nurse near the door had a phone in her hand. The camera was already recording. Monica finished her shift. She was asked 3 times by colleagues if she needed to leave early, and she said no each time, because her patients needed her, and because walking out would have felt like a concession she was not willing to make. She filed an incident report at 7:15 that evening, writing it in the same careful, factual language she used for clinical documentation, because she understood that the paper trail mattered, and that her words on that page would be read by people who had not been in that room, and who would need to understand exactly what had happened, without any ambiguity. A hospital administrator named Greg Sutton came to speak with her, visibly uncomfortable, and used phrases like the complexity of the situation and understandably emotional family members, until Monica set down her pen and looked at him and said, without raising her voice, that she would like a copy of the incident report, a meeting with legal counsel, and a clear statement from hospital leadership on the matter. Greg Sutton said, "Of course, absolutely, they would be in touch." He left, looking relieved to be leaving. In the car on the way home, Monica allowed herself to think about Daniel for the first time in several months. Not in a reaching way. She did not reach for him the way she reached for things she needed. He existed in a separate compartment of her life, sealed off not by coldness, but by the particular discipline of someone who has learned that people who love you can still leave, and that loving them does not require clinging to them. She knew what Daniel had become. She had read about it in the business press, had seen his name connected to the Kang Group, a South Korean conglomerate, with interests in construction, logistics, and private security, valued at somewhere around $6 billion, with a shadow that extended further than the press was typically willing to map. She knew that Daniel Kang was considered by certain South Korean intelligence analysts to be a man of extraordinary and somewhat unofficial influence. She also knew that he was the same boy who had followed her through the hallways of a group home in the Bronx 24 years ago, learning the English words for hungry and tired and friend, from a girl who had nothing to offer him except her attention and her company. She had not called him. Not tonight, possibly not ever, about this. She was not someone who asked her brother to fight her battles. That had always been the agreement between them, even when the agreement had never been spoken aloud. Daniel Kang was in the middle of a board meeting when his assistant, Min Jun, slid a tablet across the conference table without saying anything. Min Jun had worked for Daniel for 11 years, and he understood that there were certain things that required immediate attention, regardless of what else was happening, and that the way to communicate this was silently, with the specific stillness of a person who has already absorbed the shock so that someone else doesn't have to. Daniel looked down at the screen. The video had been posted 6 hours earlier by a nurse who had been near the door, and in those 6 hours it had been shared 340,000 times. It was 38 seconds long. Daniel watched it once. He did not react in any way that the other 11 people in the room could observe, because Daniel Kang had spent the last 2 decades cultivating a surface so composed that his own legal team sometimes found him unreadable. He said, in Korean, to Minjun, "Clear the schedule." He said it very quietly. Minjun nodded. Daniel set the tablet face down on the table and looked at the other people in the room and said, in English, that the meeting was concluded for the day and that he would be in touch with each of them individually. Then he stood up and walked out. On the private elevator, alone, he watched the video again. He had recognized Monica in the first 2 seconds, not by her face, which was partially angled away, but by the way she stood, the precise quality of stillness she held, while a man twice her size was screaming at her, the way her hands remained steady at her sides. He had seen her stand exactly like that at 8 years old, in the hallway of a group home. While a larger boy had tried to intimidate her over something so small, he couldn't remember what it was now. She had not moved. She had not flinched. She had waited until he was done, and then she had looked at him with those eyes and said something quiet that Monica had always said when she wanted to make a point, something that wasn't a threat, but somehow landed harder than. 1. Daniel had never forgotten what that stillness looked like. He was watching it now, on a tablet screen, and he was watching a man's hand strike her face, and the elevator had reached the ground floor before he realized he had been holding his breath since the moment of impact. The flight attendant brought him water, and he set it down untouched on the armrest and looked out the window at the dark over the Pacific. He thought about what it had meant to be 7 years old in a country where he didn't speak the language, in a system that was trying its best and failing in the particular quiet way that institutions fail, not through cruelty, but through the sheer arithmetic of too many children and too few people paying close enough attention. He thought about Monica finding him in the corner of the common room on his second day, sitting against the wall with his knees pulled up, and how she had simply sat down beside him without saying anything, and how she had stayed there for an hour, and how that hour had been the first thing that felt like safety since he had arrived. He thought about the night 3 months later, when 2 older boys had cornered him in the stairwell and taken the small photograph he kept in his jacket pocket, the only photograph he had of his birth mother, and how he had sat on the stairs afterward, unable to move, and how Monica had come looking for him when he didn't appear for dinner, and how she had found him there and sat with him again, and how the next morning she had gone to the 2 boys and retrieved the photograph through means she never explained, and handed it back to him without comment, as though it were simply the obvious thing to have done. He had asked her once, years later, in one of their occasional phone calls in the years after she had found him through a social media search that had taken her most of an afternoon, how she had gotten it back. She had said, with the tone of someone discussing something entirely unremarkable, that she had explained the situation clearly, and they had agreed to return it. He had known even then that this was not the complete story. It was, he had always understood, one of many small acts of ferocity she had performed on his behalf that she had never once framed as ferocity. He had done many things in his life that he could not defend in court. He had made decisions that lived in the space between legitimate business and something considerably more complicated. He had competitors who had found their financial foundations quietly undermined without ever being able to identify the source. He had contacts in regulatory bodies across 3 continents, and he had favors owed to him by men who did not appear in organizational charts. He had built all of this methodically, over many years, and he had done it in part because of a girl who had once taught him the English word for safe by pointing to the space between their 2 cots in a room they shared with 4 other children. Monica had made him feel safe when he had nothing. He did not forget things like that. He did not, under any circumstances, leave them unanswered. The Gulfstream G700 lifted off from Incheon at 2 in the morning Seoul time and landed at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey at 1:15 in the afternoon New York time, 14 hours and 35 minutes later. Daniel slept for 3 hours on the flight, which was more than he usually slept on intercontinental trips, and he used the remaining time to review the complete business biography of Richard Kane. He had a team of 6 people who specialized in exactly this kind of research, and by the time the wheels touched the runway at Teterboro, he had a document on his laptop that was 47 pages long and contained information about Richard Kane's financial architecture that Richard himself probably could not have assembled without a week and a team of accountants. Daniel read it with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who already knows what he's going to do and is simply confirming the order of operations. Richard Kane was not having a good week, and he didn't fully understand why. His father was recovering, which was a relief, though the relief was complicated by the fact that Gerald Kane had been in the room when the incident occurred and had later told his son, from his hospital bed, in the quiet voice of a man who had built things slowly and carefully over many decades, that he had raised Richard better than that. Richard had not slept well since. The incident report was generating legal attention that his general counsel described as manageable, which was lawyer language Richard had learned to translate as serious. The video had circulated widely, though Richard's communications team had issued a statement describing the incident as occurring during an extraordinarily stressful medical situation and noting that Mr. Kane deeply regretted any action taken in a moment of crisis, which was not an apology and was not intended to be one. What Richard had not anticipated was the business fallout, which arrived not in a flood, but in the quiet, draining way that real pressure always arrived, one call at a time, one postponed signature at a time, one investment partner expressing a sudden need for additional review time before a commitment could be finalized. Two of his largest Asian investment partners had gone silent. A Singapore-based sovereign wealth fund that had been close to finalizing a co-investment arrangement had requested an indefinite extension. His CFO had come to his office on a Thursday morning and said, with the careful delivery of someone delivering news they would rather not be delivering, that the Hudson River acquisition was showing signs of stress. Richard had said, that was impossible. His CFO had said he hoped so. What Richard did not know, and could not have known, was that a man he had never met, and whose name he would not have recognized, was spending those same days working with the quiet efficiency of someone disassembling a building from the foundation up. Daniel had made no dramatic gestures. He had sent no messages. He had called in no favors in any way that left fingerprints. He had simply placed conversations with the right people, in the right order, in the right language, sometimes literally, since several of the most important conversations happened in Korean, and allowed the natural consequences of those conversations to ripple outward into Richard's world in the way that water finds every crack without being directed. He had not broken any laws. He would not. That was important to him, and not only for practical reasons. Monica had asked him once, when they were children, and Daniel was planning some form of small retribution against a boy at the group home who had taken something of hers, what the right thing to do was. Monica had thought about it for a moment and said that the right thing wasn't always the satisfying thing, but that the satisfying thing wasn't always wrong, as long as it was honest. Daniel had been 7 years old, and he hadn't fully understood it, but he had carried it with him ever since, and he applied it now to every decision he made, in spaces that ordinary business could not reach. He went to see Monica on his third day in New York. He walked into Meridian General, in the way that Daniel Kang always walked into places without announcement, without any of the architectural apparatus of his wealth visible on the surface, because he had learned decades ago that the most effective version of power was the kind that didn't announce itself until it had to. He was wearing a dark coat and carrying nothing. He went to the third floor and asked at the nurse's station for Monica Williams. The nurse at the station called back to the ward. A moment later, Monica came out of a patient room, already reading something on a clipboard, and looked up and stopped completely. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. Then Monica set the clipboard down on the nurse's station counter with the particular deliberateness of someone making sure her hands have something to do, and she crossed the hallway, and Daniel met her halfway, and they stood facing each other under the fluorescent lights of a hospital corridor in New York City, 24 years after a car had turned a corner in the Bronx and driven away. They sat in the family consultation room for 40 minutes. Monica's supervisor had told her to take whatever time she needed, in the careful voice of someone who had not yet figured out who Daniel Kang was, but who could tell by the way the other nurses were looking at him, that the situation warranted discretion. Monica told Daniel what had happened factually, the way she told everything without performance, without edits, with the same precision she applied to her incident reports and her patient notes. Daniel listened without interrupting. He had the stillness that came from spending years in rooms where listening was a form of strategy. But this was different. He was still in the way that people are still when they are trying to hold something in. When Monica finished, he looked at her for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, that he was sorry he hadn't been here sooner. Monica said that wasn't how any of this worked. He said he knew. She said she wasn't asking him to fix anything. He said he wasn't going to fix anything. Exactly. She said, fixing him with a look he had known since he was 7 years old, that she didn't want anyone to get hurt. He said nobody was going to get hurt. She said she wanted this handled legally, publicly, properly. He said he understood. He said he had already been working on it. She said she had noticed she had read about the investment partners. She wasn't unobservant, and she looked at him with the complicated expression of someone who is grateful and exasperated in exactly equal measure. He said, almost smiling, that he didn't know what she was referring to. She said, not smiling at all, but close to it, that she was sure he didn't. Richard Kane received the invitation to a business meeting through a channel he considered reliable. It came from a firm he recognized, a Korean investment group with a strong track record in exactly the kind of portfolio acquisitions that Richard needed right now, given that his existing deal was showing the previously mentioned stress. His general counsel reviewed the letter of intent and found nothing unusual. His CFO was enthusiastic. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning at a conference center in Midtown, and Richard arrived 10 minutes early, which was unusual for him, and which he didn't examine too closely. He was shown to a conference room on the 32nd floor with a view of the park, and he sat down and waited. And a minute later, the door opened. The man who walked in was not one of the associate partners Richard had been communicating with. He was someone Richard had never seen before. He sat down across from Richard without offering a hand, and he looked at Richard with eyes that were entirely calm and entirely steady, and Richard felt, for the first time in the meeting, and without being able to explain exactly why, that he was at a disadvantage. Daniel Kang placed a folder on the table. He did not open it. He said, in accented but precise English, that he appreciated Richard's time. Richard said, because he defaulted to the language of business deals in unfamiliar situations, that he was eager to discuss the opportunity. Daniel said that the opportunity they were going to discuss was not the one in the letter of intent. Richard asked what opportunity they were discussing then. Daniel opened the folder. Inside was a printed photograph. It was a still frame from the video. Monica's face was turned partially toward the camera. Daniel's finger rested on the image for a moment, and then he said, still with perfect calm, "The woman you slapped is my sister." The room was very quiet. Richard looked at the photograph. He looked at Daniel, he said, with the specific cadence tone of a man whose lawyers had trained him to be careful about admissions, that the situation at the hospital had been a very difficult time, and that he deeply regretted. Daniel said, without raising his voice at all, "Don't. Just that word." Richard stopped. Daniel looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of someone who has thought very carefully about this conversation and has decided exactly how much patience he is willing to extend. Then he said that he was not there to make a deal. He was there because Monica would have wanted him to come in person, rather than let what had been already set in motion simply run its course, and because Monica's wishes mattered to him more than his preference for efficiency. Richard, for the first time in a very long time, had no prepared response. He sat in a 32nd floor conference room in Midtown Manhattan, looking at a photograph of a woman he had struck, and he understood, with the slow, cold clarity of someone standing in the shadow of something much larger than they had realized, that he had made a serious error. Not strategically, not legally. He had made a human error, and it had consequences that money could not simply absorb. What followed happened in stages, and each stage was worse than the one before. The video, which had seemed like a 3-day story, was re-amplified when a major financial publication ran a piece connecting the incident at the hospital to the sudden withdrawal of several Asian investment partners from Richard's portfolio. The article didn't name Daniel Kang directly. It was written carefully, with sources who spoke only on background, but it traced a pattern that was clear enough to anyone paying attention. The Kane Properties Group Board convened an emergency session. 2 independent directors called for a review of executive conduct standards. 3 of Richard's 5 largest institutional investors requested calls with the company's general counsel. The Hudson River acquisition, which had been the centerpiece of Richard's professional identity for the better part of 2 years, was put on indefinite hold by the seller, who cited concerns about the stability of the acquiring entity's leadership structure in language so measured it could only have been written by lawyers. Richard's communications team put out 3 statements in 5 days. None of them contained the word apology. This was noticed. Richard's communications team put out 3 statements in 5 days. None of them contained the word apology. This was noticed. Online, the story had acquired the particular staying power of narratives that connect a specific visible act to larger invisible patterns. The video was not just a video of one man striking one woman. It had become, in the way that these things become, a text through which people read things they already felt about wealth, about entitlement, about the specific way power expresses itself when it believes no one important is watching. Commentators who covered healthcare worker conditions used it as an entry point into discussions about the frequency of patient-family violence in hospital settings. Publications that covered executive conduct cited it in longer investigations into corporate culture. A hospital workers' union included it in materials distributed at a national conference. Richard's name, which had previously appeared in the business press in the context of deals and developments and strategic acquisitions, began appearing in different kinds of articles, in different kinds of publications, read by different kinds of people, and none of those articles were favorable. His communications director, a woman named Cynthia, who had managed reputational crises for 3 previous clients, and who was, by all accounts, very good at her job, came to his office on the second Friday and said, carefully, that the standard approach was not working, and that the reason the standard approach was not working was that there had been no actual accountability from which the standard approach could pivot. She said it as kindly as she could. Richard sat with it. Gerald Kane noticed it too. He was out of the hospital now, recovering at home, slower and quieter than he had been before the cardiovascular episode, and with the particular clarity that sometimes comes to people after they have been frightened by their own bodies. He called Richard on a Thursday evening and asked him, without preamble, whether he had actually apologized to the nurse. Richard said his team had issued statements. Gerald said he hadn't asked about statements. Richard was quiet. Gerald said, with the patience of a man who had built something slowly and knew the value of things that were constructed carefully, that he had watched the video. He said he hadn't raised Richard to do that. He said it was not about the business, though the business was suffering. He said it was about the fact that a woman had been doing her job and had been struck by his son, and that until his son faced that directly, nothing else was going to be resolved in any way that counted. Richard sat with the phone pressed to his ear and did not say anything for long enough that Gerald said his name twice. Then Richard said he would think about it. Gerald said quietly, to think faster. The apology, when it happened, did not happen the way Richard's communications team had suggested. They had proposed a written statement, reviewed and approved by legal, to be issued through a publicist. Richard had initially agreed with this approach. Then he hadn't slept for 2 nights, and on the morning of the 3rd day he called his assistant and said he needed Monica Williams's work schedule. His assistant said she was not sure she could obtain that. Richard said to figure it out. An hour later, he was in his car, driving to Meridian General, with no team, no lawyer, and no prepared language. He went to the 3rd floor and asked for Monica Williams, and was told she was with a patient. He said he would wait. He waited for 23 minutes in a plastic chair in the hallway, which was not the kind of waiting Richard Kane typically did, and which cost him something that was probably worth something. When Monica came out of the patient room and saw him sitting there, she stopped. She looked at him with the same eyes she had looked at him with on the day he had struck her, steady, clear, giving nothing away. He stood up. He was not wearing a suit. He said her name, the right name this time, Monica, and he said he needed to speak with her, and that she didn't have to agree to it, and that he would leave if she told him to. She studied him for a long moment. She said she had 10 minutes. They sat across from each other, in the family consultation room that Monica had sat in with Daniel 3 weeks before. Richard Kane did not prepare what he was going to say, which was possibly the first time in his professional life that he had entered a significant conversation without preparation, and which made the words he said less polished and more true. He said that he had done something unforgivable. He said he knew that word was doing a lot of work in the sentence, and that he was not asking her to verify it in either direction. He said he had been frightened about his father, and that he had taken that fear and turned it into something it had no right to be, and that it had landed on her, and that the reason it had landed on her was because she had been doing her job correctly, and he had been unwilling, in that moment, to be in the presence of someone who wasn't going to rearrange themselves around his need to feel in control. He said he knew what that sounded like. He said he wasn't sure there was a version of this that ended with him not being the person who had done it. He sat there, and he let that be true. Monica listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, and Richard let it be uncomfortable rather than filling it, which cost him something too. Monica said finally, that she wasn't going to tell him he was forgiven, because forgiveness was not something she dispensed on a schedule, and because what he had done had consequences that extended beyond the moment, and she had a right to take time with what she did with it. She said she could see that he was trying. She said trying was a start. She said that if he wanted to make something of it, the hospital's Nursing Staff Association had a fund for nurses facing workplace harassment, and that it was underfunded, and that a man with his resources might find that a more meaningful gesture than a publicist's statement. Richard said he would make a donation. She said she wasn't asking for a donation. She was telling him what a meaningful gesture would look like. He could decide whether he wanted to make one. Richard Kane made the donation a substantial one, announced publicly, with a statement that this time contained actual accountability and was reviewed not by his communications team, but by his father, who read it once and said it was close, and then read it again and said it would do. He appeared before his company's board and answered questions without a lawyer in the room, which his general counsel considered an act of professional insanity, and which Richard considered, on reflection, the only version of the conversation he could live with. He paused the Hudson River acquisition voluntarily, not because the deal was dead, but because he needed to be certain that when it closed, it would close on the strength of what the company actually was, rather than on the momentum of what he had been refusing to look at. It cost him 6 months and a renegotiated price. His CFO said it was recoverable. His father said it was right. Daniel Kang flew back to Seoul on a Wednesday. Monica drove him to the airport. They sat in the departures lane for 20 minutes, because neither of them was entirely willing to be the one to end the conversation, which was how it had always been between them, even when they were children. And the social worker was coming to take one of them somewhere new. He told her, at some point during those 20 minutes, that he had never stopped thinking about her. She said she knew. He said that wasn't enough, probably. She said it was enough for now. He told her that the word now had different implications than she might intend. She said she had intended exactly those implications. He said he would be back in the spring. She said she would be here. He got out of the car with his bag, and he stood at the curb for a moment, and she watched him through the windshield, the way she had watched a car turn a corner 24 years ago in the Bronx. This time, before he turned toward the terminal, he looked back. Monica Williams returned to her shift the next morning at 6:15, 45 minutes before she needed to be there. She put her things in her locker and looked at the photograph of her mother and read the note she had written to herself during her second year of nursing school. Then she clipped her ID badge to her lapel, the same badge she had picked up from the floor of a hospital room on a day that had changed more things than she had expected, and she walked out to the ward and found the first patient who needed her and began. In the weeks that followed, her colleagues noticed something about her that they found difficult to name precisely. It wasn't that she was different. She was the same Monica who arrived early, who stayed late, who remembered the name of every patient's family member who had sat in the hallway and waited. It was more that she carried herself with a quality that had always been there, but now seemed settled in a way that even she could not entirely account for, as though something that had been held in suspension had finally resolved not into victory, exactly, not into triumph, but into the quieter and more durable thing that comes after you have been tested and have not broken, and have looked at the people around you and understood clearly what you are made of and what they are made of, and how to tell the Prosperous Seven difference. There was no dramatic punctuation to the morning, no sense of resolution that announced itself. There was only the work, which was the thing she had always been able to count on, and the particular quality of quiet that settles over a person who has been through something difficult and has come through it not unscathed, but intact, which is not the same thing, and which is, in its own way, better. She passed the family consultation room. On her way to the supply station, she did not stop. She kept moving, because there was a patient at the end of the hall who needed her, and she was steady. Richard Kane, in the months that followed, became someone that people who knew him found slightly harder to recognize and slightly easier to be around. He did not become a different person. He did not have a transformation that made for a clean story. He became someone who had been brought, through a sequence of events he had not anticipated and could not have controlled, to the edge of what his money could protect him from, and who had looked over that edge and seen that the thing on the other side of it was not ruin but truth, and who had decided, slowly and imperfectly, and with more setbacks than successes, to do something with that. He visited his father more often. He learned, at 51, to sit in a room without his phone for more than 10 minutes. He did not always succeed. He established a formal workplace conduct review process at Kane Properties Group that his HR director described as more substantive than anything comparable she had seen at a company of their size. He did not do any of these things because they were good for the company's reputation, though they were. He did them because his father had looked at him from a hospital bed and said he had raised him better than that, and because a woman he had wronged had told him that trying was a start, and because somewhere in the architecture of Richard Kane, beneath the money and the ambition and the 45 years of never having had to apologize, there was a person who understood, finally, what it meant to be accountable to something other than a balance sheet. The last time Richard spoke to Monica directly was at a benefit dinner that the hospital held the following spring. He was there as a donor. She was there as a member of the Nursing Staff Association that had organized the event. They were in the same room for 3 hours without speaking. And then, near the end of the evening, they found themselves standing near the same table, and Richard said her name, and Monica looked at him, and he said only that he hoped she was well. She said she was. He said he was glad. Then he said, because it was the thing he had been carrying for months and had not found the occasion to say directly, that he had a question he had been wanting to ask her. She said she was listening. He said, "Why didn't you tell me who your brother was?" He asked it genuinely, without strategy, without the protective layer of language that he had spent his career applying over every question that mattered. Monica looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled, not warmly, exactly, but with the specific expression of someone who has thought about this question before and has already arrived at the answer. She said, "Because respect should never depend on who stands behind someone." Richard looked at her. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. She was right. She had been right all along. She had known it on the day she picked her badge up from the floor and faced him with eyes that gave nothing away, and she had known it every day since. And the knowing of it had made her more formidable than anything he could have brought to bear against her, because it was the kind of knowledge that couldn't be bought, couldn't be leveraged, and couldn't be taken from a person no matter how loudly the room went silent around them. True power isn't making people fear you. It's treating people with dignity when you think they have none, and understanding, finally, when you've been wrong about who was powerful all along.